How should we define and measure poverty?
A New Lens on Poverty.
By Elliott and Marina. So we wanted to start off our presentation by just giving a hypothetical scenario. So imagine there's a family who lives in a small, cramped apartment in a struggling neighborhood. The parents work multiple jobs, yet they barely make enough to cover the basic necessities. Their children go to school hungry, often missing meals because there isn't enough food at home. The family lacks access to adequate health care, forcing them to choose between visiting a doctor or paying for utilities. As a result, their health deteriorates, and the stress of financial instability weighs heavily on their well-being. This cycle of poverty leaves them feeling trapped, with hopes for a better future dimmed by their current struggle for survival.
How we define poverty. A lack of resources for food, clothing, shelter, utilities, and healthcare, which directly impacts an individual's quality of life and overall well-being. This definition encompasses basic survival needs critical to well-being.
So, how we want to measure poverty. We believe that income should be measured after taxes, where one lives or their environment. We also believe that government benefits should not be included in measuring poverty, and it should be measured on the average amount of resources needed for food, clothing, shelter, and utilities. We believe number of dependents are counted, and healthcare needs are counted as well. And we think this is really important because we need to be careful not to fall into the fallacy of measurement. The fallacy of measurement refers to the pitfalls that can arise when interpreting data and defining constructs in research and analysis, like relying solely on quantitative measures can overlook the multidimensional nature of poverty, utilizing data collection methods that are poorly designed or even poorly executed, and or just focusing solely on economic measurements like income. So, touching on the idea that food, clothing, shelter, utilities, and healthcare can directly impact one's overall well-being, we need to respect everybody's dignity. Because someone may have a roof over their head, but may live in overcrowded or unsafe conditions, impacting their health and well-being. So, we also wanted to start by saying Aristotle once said, dignity does not consist in possessing honors, but in the consciousness that we deserve them. So what does this mean? How does this apply to measuring and defining poverty? So we said that Aristotle is really trying to say that having a sense of dignity is ultimately about understanding and acknowledging one's own worth. So rather than just merely accumulating titles and or accolades. And we think that this relates to our definition of poverty because if one has a lack of resources of food, clothing, shelter, and utilities, and healthcare, this again could lead to diminishing feelings of dignity and self-worth.
Why we include the concept of quality of life in our definition of poverty. Life should be enjoyed and experienced. Without food, clothing, shelter, and utilities, one is unable to have a sustainable life. One needs to have these basic needs in order to have a good quality of life. Our definition: lack of resources for food, clothing, shelter, utilities, and healthcare, which directly impacts an individual's quality of life and overall well-being. Our counter-argument of our definition is that you can be out of poverty and still be struggling, and that food, clothing, shelter, utilities, and healthcare are not enough. For example, a single mother has recently secured a job that pays $45,000 a year. On paper, she is no longer living in poverty. However, her struggles continue. Despite her income, the mom cannot afford quality childcare, which makes it difficult for her to maintain consistent work hours. Additionally, her wages are not enough to cover unexpected expenses, such as car repairs, which leaves her financially vulnerable. While she has escaped poverty, her quality of life is still diminished due to ongoing stress and financial instability. You may have food, clothing, shelter, utilities, and healthcare needs met, and have a good quality of life, but still be struggling. We cannot define or predetermine if one is financially struggling. People have other needs and wants that they cannot meet, but they are still considered out of poverty. Food, clothing, shelter, utilities, and healthcare are not enough to have a sustainable life, but in terms of defining poverty, it is a good measurement. We totally agree with these statements. However, when putting together a definition and measurement, we feel this is the best way to do so.
So, again, like Marina said, while our definition of poverty emphasizes the lack of resources for food, clothing, shelter, utility, and healthcare, and acknowledges that individuals may be out of poverty yet still facing significant struggles, it's essential to shift our focus to a broader perspective. Developed by economist Amartya Sen, this approach transcends mere financial measures and highlights what individuals are truly able to achieve with the resources available to them. So, the capabilities approach, our definition that we strongly support is that it's the approach that defines what resources one has and the abilities of an individual. We said that the key points is that this approach emphasizes individual agency and one's personal well-being over income metrics and or numbers. Another key point we said is that it's crucial to recognize that each individual's capabilities are influenced by their unique obstacles or personal challenges. Gender, race, sexuality, class, and location all can be barriers. We believe that this picture is a framework for evaluating and assessing human well-being and social justice. The graph depicts the distinction between capabilities and functionings, and then the agency of choice aspect emphasizes the ability of individuals to make choices and act upon them. So what we don't like about the capabilities approach is that it overlooks the importance of social and economic structures that influences people's capabilities. So, for example, access to healthcare can depend heavily on systemic issues such as affordability, availability of services, and discrimination, which can again impact quality of life. What we like about the capabilities approach is that it supports the idea that poverty should not be seen in terms of lacking specific resources, but also in terms of lacking the capabilities to lead a fulfilling life. So, for instance, someone might have access to food, but lack the capability to make healthy choices due to education or even information gaps.
How does our definition of poverty relate to Rector's argument? Again, to reiterate, our definition is the lack of resources for food, clothing, shelter, utilities, and healthcare. What would Rector think about this definition? Rector's argument, he stated that for most Americans, the word poverty suggests destitution and inability to provide a family with nutritious food, clothing, and reasonable shelter. One can be in poverty but still have resources such as an Xbox and a fridge. Why are we focusing on individuals who have resources but are not using them in an appropriate way? While there are certainly families that experience severe hardships, such as temporary food shortages or homelessness, the living conditions of the average impoverished household have improved over time. Many amenities that were once considered luxuries are now commonplace, even in poor households, partly due to the decreasing prices for consumer goods over time.
Again, in relation to the definition of poverty as lack of resources for food, clothing, shelter, utilities, and healthcare, Rector would most likely agree that the lack of these essential resources constitutes poverty.
Rector's argument. What we don't like. While Rector's initial definition or argument recognizes that the lack of resources affects quality of life, it may fail to adequately account for how poverty limits individuals' capacities to achieve their potential. We believe that the definition of poverty needs to show how people are prevented from having the best quality of life that they can. While reading the Allison memoir, we saw the correlation between poverty and quality of life and want our definition to reflect this. What we like about Rector's argument. Rector understands it is most important to focus on those who need the resources most. Some may be in poverty but have Xboxes, fridges, and other non-necessities. We believe that resources should be focused on the people who need it most. If one has the resources, they should be using them in an appropriate way. Resources should not be wasted if someone is going to use them in a wasteful way.